When I first opened Abbey Orchestra Clarinets for the first time, and I played a note, I said, oh no. So Abbey Orchestra Clarinets is the latest module in the Abbey Orchestra line from Spitfire Audio. For the past maybe year and a half, each of these have been coming out in a sort of drip fashion. The idea is extremely detailed libraries focused on specific sections of the orchestra. The last release was Flutes, which featured 2 flutes recorded in unison, and that was the first library in the Woodwinds line. And now we have the second one, which is Clarinets. By the way, I've made a review for each Abbey Orchestra product so far here on the channel. I haven't done a strings one yet, but that is coming soon actually. If you want to check those out, go ahead and do so if you're curious about those libraries. Okay, so I have a lot of things that I want to sort of go into, but first, let's listen to the library. So, I have the library pulled up here in the same player, Abbey Orchestra Clarinets. And like I mentioned at the jump, I said to myself, uh-oh, when I played this. I'm gonna play a little bit of the library and see if you can guess what I'm talking about. The first thing I noticed when I played a single held note in this library was a ton of vibrato in the sound. Now, I have this controller here that controls a few things. So this is modulation, this is expression, and then this third slider I have is to control vibrato. Now, I was playing, noticed the vibrato, and then reached for my vibrato slider. Nothing was happening, so I click into the knob, and the vibrato option is grayed out. There is no way to affect what the degree of vibrato you're using in your clarinet sound. Now, why is this important? So, for most classical clarinet playing, it is mostly understood the sound of the clarinet in a classical setting is no vibrato. This is most common in, I say, the US, throughout Europe, and I think throughout the world. Now, I brought this up once in a review I did several years ago for the BBC Symphony Orchestra, and I talked about the clarinet and that you're able to affect the vibrato in that library, so I just said that I turn it off by default whenever I have the clarinet open because that's just the sound. No vibrato on the clarinet in a classical setting. And I had a commenter write that it's actually pretty common to use vibrato on the clarinet in Britain. I thought, that's very interesting. I never knew that. So I looked it up. There is a tradition of using vibrato in an orchestral or concert setting, classical setting in the UK. And that's sort of been pioneered by a couple of people, namely Reginald Kelly, who was a clarinetist. But the fact sort of still remains, the style of the clarinet is to be played with no vibrato. Granted, I'm not a woodwind player, I'm a percussionist, so I could be missing something here or making a bigger deal than it is about this, but I did ask a friend of mine who's an accomplished clarinet player, and I asked him, hey, do you know why the clarinet doesn't use vibrato? And he said, because they just don't. In fact, he said that when he was in college studying clarinet with his professors, they just flat out told them, don't use vibrato ever. Now, vibrato is, of course, very common on clarinet in jazz and folk music. And this isn't to say that you can't ever use vibrato on clarinet in an orchestral setting. But what I am saying is that that is not typically the norm. And so I wonder what the decision making was there. Was there a conscious decision to record this beautiful legato patch with vibrato, but not without? Now, in the flutes library, there is also no option to change the vibrato. The vibrato is baked in, but that's very characteristic of the flute. In practically every recording that I've found of a clarinet in an orchestral setting that's at a soloistic capacity, all of them are played straight. And it's a very beautiful sound. And I hear all kinds of theories for why the reason for vibrato is frowned upon, being maybe like the odd harmonics of the clarinet just don't lend themselves well to changing the pitch because it's very like obvious or emphasized or something like that. I really don't know. Now, in the long articulation here, you can change the vibrato. And I think that's a very lovely characteristic sound. But the long articulation in this library is meant for other things. It isn't meant to be this incredibly detailed performance legato extended patch that's meant for all kinds of things. By the way, Spitfire did send me this library for review. No money exchanged hands. They didn't tell me to say anything about the library. These are all just my thoughts. So Spitfire is a British company. They are based in England. They're based in London. And the session musicians surely are also the same. So I wonder if it was something that they had input on, or someone on the staff who was putting this together, or who was in charge of say, recording these, either didn't know or deliberately did decide, let's record all of these with vibrato. So all I can say is I hope that there's been recordings done without vibrato, or if the long articulation recordings can be applied into the performance legato but as a no vibrato option. I don't know any of the details of how exactly they record the legato articulations. Naturally, you would assume one note at a time, but the transitions from one note to another introduces another thing. But anyway, it's just, if you were to have the option of recording your clarinets with or without vibrato, I think most people would choose no vibrato. Okay, so I keep faffing on about this vibrato thing. The vibrato aside, I think this library is very strong. Now, this library is just like the flutes library before it. Two clarinets playing in unison together, seated in the orchestral setting at Abbey Road Studio 1. I think it has a lovely sound in this room. They're just like the other libraries. There are two styles of the legato: performance, which is meant for moments with faster notes, and it sounds quite lovely. We have the longs. These are long sforzando, which is sort of described as an overblown beginning to a note. And then several short articulations, so staccato. An alternate staccato. Which sounds just slightly longer. I like this option because that way, if the music is slower but you still need short notes, these staccato, very short ones don't quite stick out as much. And then a staccatissimo, or very, very short one. That sounds really great for effect. I probably wouldn't use that like as my default short note sound. I think the start of the note is a little too crisp, but I think if you want things to stick out, that's a good one to use. Marcato, so strong beginning to the note. A tenuto, so a extended one, and then double tonguing, triple tonguing, quad tonguing, just like the flutes library. You can change the length of that with the modulation wheel, which I like. It sounds good. Flutter, which is when you sort of roll your tongue against the, in this case, reed of the instrument. And then these are sort of, this is the basic long. You hear that start of the note? It sounded a little out of tune there for a moment before the intonation sort of fixed. Like the two players coming against each other. I didn't mention this in the flutes review, but I did think it when I was playing around with that library, was that the intonation was just impeccable between the two players that they recorded. This one definitely sounds a little thicker, as in I can tell that the two players are playing at the same time because there's a little bit of phasing happening. Now, naturally that'll happen. There are minute little details between the two players that makes the sound thicker. The sort of analogy you might use is when you have a synthesizer play a note with two oscillators, you can slightly detune one of the oscillators and it'll make the sound fatter or thicker. And that's because the sound is sort of like not perfectly together like this, but just a little off, and it makes it sound girthier. So that is, you know, a sound that you would anticipate with two clarinets that are recorded together. As well as that, we have in this pro version of the library several different mixes. Okay, so enough about that. I have been playing around with the library for a few days, and I want to show a couple things that I've been doing just to get a sense for the library and the sound. So I played around earlier with the Abbey Road Orchestra instruments, including, of course, the clarinet, and quickly put down like a quick sketch of something. So this is my ultimate template, which if you're interested, you can get for yourself at ernestocomposer.com/templates. But basically, I've integrated this library into my template. Since these are A2 or A2 recordings, and BBC Symphony Orchestra, which is my default bread and butter orchestra for a long time, doesn't have that sound. I put it in here between the solo clarinet and the A3 clarinets of BBC. So it's in here. I also included a little Abbey Road Orchestra metal percussion, just a triangle real quick, and then a little bit of the Abbey Road Symphonic Strings library, which I mentioned. There's a review of that coming soon. I have thoughts about it. So let's just listen to what I put down. Okay, so every time I hear the library, the vibrato just sticks out to me so much, and I can't help but wonder how great it would sound with the clarinets a little bit more straight. That could also be a thing of two players playing together in unison, playing with vibrato, because sometimes, like I mentioned, the intonation might not be spot on. So they use vibrato or slightly altering the pitch back and forth so that it sort of sounds like they're within the same range, because you can't really tell. They're going up and down. Regardless, I love the way this sounds against the rest of the orchestra. Like I mentioned, I really like that mix 2 sound, so that's what that was. Let's listen to what that sounds like with mix 1. To me, it sounds a little further away, but that's sort of the idea. Let's try that with the section overheads. So clearly a much closer sound. It's still a really nice sound, and you can tell that there are two clarinet players playing the same thing together, which I actually find really, really nice. Okay, so if you watched my flutes review video, which if you haven't and you're curious about that, I would say go and check out. Then you know that I have this mock-up of Marian's theme from Raiders of the Lost Ark by John Williams that I originally made with BBC Symphony Orchestra. The idea of this was, as these libraries start to come out, replacing the BBC Symphony Orchestra sounds with the Abbey Road Orchestra sounds, to sort of compare the two, frankly. So far I've replaced the strings with symphonic strings, the flutes A2, and the clarinets now A2. I mentioned this in the last review as well. The A2 doubling is most effective when it's blending against other instruments. Essentially to make the sound bigger, thicker, have it part of more of a section than an individual line. So in John Williams' orchestration here, the melody when it comes in is played by two flutes and two clarinets in unison, and then a celeste sounding an octave higher above that. And that's against some strings. But the melody is played by two clarinets in unison, two flutes in unison. And what I was missing from BBC was there were only individual instruments recorded and an A3 section recorded, three instruments playing at the same time. Woodwinds are already naturally louder than string instruments, so it was more difficult to balance the two, so I ended up duplicating the individual instruments to try and get them sounding together. So I'm glad that we have an A2 sound recorded on its own, and if I ever want to use three in unison, then I could use what is presumably coming in the future, which is the solo instruments recorded. So the A2 instrument plus the solo instrument equals 3. Let's see what this sounds like in context of what unison woodwinds are actually meant for, and that's blending together with other sections. You get the idea. I think it's a really nice, lovely sound, and I like the way these libraries balance against each other. It sounds very natural to me. The default mixes in BBC were just, for me, too heavy and too, like, I don't know, mix 1 in BBC sounds like there's a ton of microphones up in that sound. And in Abbey Road Orchestra, it sounds a little bit more selective. Tree, outrigger, couple close mics, not much more than that. So I like the sort of natural sound that has in this space, and they're beautifully recorded as well. Like, I feel like I can tell a difference in the quality of microphones that they're using in this. Okay, let's listen to that again, but without the celeste, without it, because that's still BBC. So let's just listen to these Abbey Road Orchestra instruments only. Yeah, very lovely. Okay, so this takes me to one of my last points, which is the pricing of this library. Now, as I discussed in the flutes review, I did find the library to be quite expensive for what you got in return, and it seemed like many other people on the internet thought the same. I also make the case in that video that there are ways to justify the price for that library and ways to unjustify the price for that library. And it's just, depending on who you are, you would fall into one of those categories. Basically, my thesis was this line of libraries is specifically targeted for ultra pros. So these are composers or professionals who on a project might make 6 to 7 figures scoring something. And I've never been in that position myself, but I do know people who have actually achieved numbers like that in the work that they do. If you're making that kind of money per project, a $300 library that is used for your work, that you can write off for your taxes, that you can frankly afford, that's not going to put a dent in your library. And if it sounds good to you, considering the cost it would be to record in Abbey Road studios, cost of hiring musicians and everything like that, then you can easily justify that for yourself. If you're in the camp where you're not anywhere near that, then $300 seemed like a lot of money, which it is. So it seems like Spitfire sort of took that into account, and what I thought would happen did happen, and that was when First Violins came out just as its own module. It was priced at a certain point. It seemed like that was a little bit too much, and then the cellos, which was effectively the same amount of content, was reduced in price. So it seems like it's $99 for core, $249 for pro. Now that's certainly a reduction in price, and if you're looking at these libraries, you likely already have other Abbey Road Orchestra instruments, maybe a couple too, and there's a cross-grade. Ooh. Oh no, oh no, oh no. You're kidding me. Okay, so my screen recorder just crashed. So none of what I just recorded for you appeared for the library. Okay, that's fine. I'll have to just throw in like footage I record after the fact. Okay. That's fine. That's fine. Ah, snap. I have to record this now. There's not an opportunity to record this at a later date. All right. Anyway, as I was saying, there are cross grades that exist for the Abbey Road Orchestra line. So if you own a couple libraries from that, you get a discount in this library. If you were one of the people who got Abbey Road Orchestra flutes, this would be a little cheaper for you. And introductory pricing is always really appealing as well. So this library is much more manageable for more people, and especially the core version of this library, $99, 99 euros, 99 pounds. With those discounts applied, I think this is killer if you don't mind that vibrato sound and the legatos. And I'll keep bringing this up because I think it's really, really important. If there are woodwind players, clarinetists, reed players, whatever, in watching this, I really, really love your input on this to see how important this is or isn't. Like I mentioned, these are two clarinets playing in unison. This isn't a solo clarinet, which I do believe a solo clarinet is more important than two clarinets recorded in unison together. So I'll hold out reservation for what that could possibly mean for the future. I do hope, however, that the solo clarinet, when it comes to us with the option to have either vibrato or no vibrato. If there's no option, let it be no vibrato, because that's just more usable in an orchestral classical context setting, which this is trying to be. And again, this can do with taste. If you like the vibrato sound, if you like the vibrato style, then go with it. For example, with jazz, even in jazz, saxophones using vibrato is sort of known to be an old-fashioned sound, like the sound of the saxophones in jazz context in the 20s and the 30s. Modern jazz, when saxophones are playing together, they typically don't use vibrato together because that's just out of style, it's out of fashion. So I don't mean to be saying that it's invalid to have vibrato baked into these sounds. I just want the option. And for some reason, it's only the clarinets. This isn't a thing for flutes, oboes, bassoons, any of their auxiliary instruments. it's only clarinets, but that's the sound. So if these line of libraries are trying to be the end-all be-all libraries, then I think it's essential that Spitfire introduce an update to the library with no vibrato, because I would always have no vibrato on the clarinets. I would almost never use the vibrato on the clarinet unless I needed something in a different style. But again, I would prefer to use the solo clarinet for that, not two clarinets recorded in unison. But you never know. So having the option is nice. Okay, so would I recommend this library? If you're going into this Abbey Road Orchestra bubble, then I say it's something that you should probably go for. For two clarinets recorded in unison and nothing else, so not a solo clarinet, there's no E-flat clarinet, there's no bass or contrabass clarinets, it's only this. I would suggest, just like flutes, to go for the core version of this library. The Mix 1, which is all you get in that library, is a very, very usable, big sounding, as in you can definitely hear the size of the room. So if you don't mind that sort of baked in space, but that's sort of the point with Abbey Road, then go for the core version. And I think for less than $100, it's a fantastic addition to your overall template. What I would say is to save your money for a pro version of whatever solo clarinet thing might be coming. I assume, or at least I hope, it's a collection of solo clarinets, so B-flat clarinet and then all of the auxiliary instruments. If there's a library that's just clarinet, Abbey Road Orchestra clarinet, then, you know, whatever, hopefully that's a decent price as well. But I would go pro for that, because you're going to be using that library more often than you're going to be using this library. Like I mentioned, this library is fantastic for blending with other sections, but you can fake that with a solo one if you really need to. Would I recommend it? For the right people, yes. And my goodness, I hope that there's a Senza vibrato option or no vibrato option coming soon, because I don't want to have to use the long articulation just to get the typical sound that I want out of the clarinet. So if it weren't for that one contingency, I could, with good faith, recommend this library to people who want to fill out their virtual orchestra and their template with the Abbey Road sound. Depending on who you are, whether the vibrato or no vibrato matters to you or not, then that's frankly up to you to determine whether that matters to you or not. You could hear the example of it blending with the flutes in this context, and I think it does sound really nice. It just sounds like there's a lot of vibrato. And I don't know if the odd overtone thing is legit. I know that the clarinet's overtones are quite unique, but maybe just that pitch going up and down just really is emphasized on clarinets. Okay, so that was Abbey Road Orchestra clarinets. I really, really hope that you found value out of this video to help you determine whether this library is for you or not. I really like the adjustment that Spitfire made with the pricing. You know, when you run a company, everything isn't super clear all of the time. And if you put something out and the market doesn't like it, the market will tell you, and it's up to you to adjust, and Spitfire did. So I'm happy to see that, especially these libraries, which I anticipate there will be quite a lot of them, will be really great over time. And if you decide to go pro with this library in the future because you've gone core first, then you get a prorated rate on pro and you don't have to pay a little more than maybe you need. But still, I would wait for the solo clarinet. Okay, that's all I have for you today. Let me know if you have any questions about something that maybe I glossed over or didn't bring up in this video, and I'll try to answer your questions as detailed as I can. Let me know your thoughts. If you're a woodwind player, if you're a clarinet player especially, tell me what you think about using vibrato or no vibrato in a classical or concert setting. I think it's that way for the majority of the world. If you're a British clarinet player, tell me whether you use vibrato or not. All of that. All right. Thanks so very much for watching, and as always, take care.